sunshine and nutrients and water and carbon dioxide. And they get the carbon dioxide from the coral. The coral breathes like we do, not with lungs, but it still produces carbon dioxide as a waste product of its respiration. The algae inside the tissues produce oxygen, so the coral likes that because they need oxygen as well to respire. And so what happens is that the algae produce food, the corals get a lot of that food, and so the algae is really the engine behind coral nutrition. So they are plants in a way, they're plants and animals at the same time. So here's a cutaway of a coral and how it works. The green and red part here is the coral tissue, that's the living tissue, and underneath that you can see these little kind of cups that the corallites sit in, which are made of this chalky substance, calcium carbonate. So where are coral reefs found? Well, coral reefs are very picky in terms of their distribution. The corals that make them like the conditions to be just right. So they're really the Goldilocks of animals. They don't like it too hot, they don't like it too cold. And so coral reefs occur where the average temperature in a year doesn't fall much below 20 degrees centigrade, which is about 70 Fahrenheit or so. And they do go into hotter regions. So, for example, the Red Sea, where I started this presentation, gets up to 28, 29, even 30 degrees centigrade there. It's very hot. That's up towards the 90s. So this is a warm environment. They also need it to be very sunny because these algae in their tissues need sunlight to photosynthesize. And one of the things that makes it not so favorable for photosynthesis is the presence of mud in the water. So sediment loading will reduce the suitability of a place for corals to grow because it blocks the sunshine out. They also need salty water. They don't like fresh water at all, so they have to live in places where there's kind of full ocean salinity, which is about 3.5% salt. They can't dry out, so they have to live underwater all the time. If you were to take this coral out of the water and it was covered in living tissue, then it would probably only last half an hour or so before it was dead, because they really are very sensitive to drying. And then they are also affected by ocean currents and so on in terms of where they are. So this is the kind of coral reef that I fell in love with. This is my first experience of a coral reef. They tend to grow up towards sea level, and then they stop because sea level stops and they can't grow out of the water. But then they grow towards the ocean, so they head out towards the ocean. And you can see here, this is a photograph taken exactly from the edge of the reef. And as you come off the top, which is very shallow, you can then see there's a big drop off down there, dropping into deep water. Sometimes that drop off can plunge hundreds of meters, even 1,000 feet down into the sea, very close to the edge. So it really does feel like you're standing on the edge of a mountain and looking down into this. But of course the fish don't mind, and nor do you, because you can float. I think the most striking thing about a coral reef is that it is full of the most abundant fish life and all sorts of other creatures that you can imagine. And so we're used to having to work quite hard to see wild animals outdoors. And so, you know, you go out with your binoculars to watch birds or mammals. You have to stalk for a long time to get close to them. When you jump into a coral reef, you're right in there, and all the fish are swirling around your head. You have them bumping into you sometimes. They don't mind your presence at all. They're perfectly unfazed by being in the presence of somebody who's down there under the sea, and it's a fantastic experience. And you also come across characters like this. This is one of the first big fish that I saw. not this particular one, but I remember the experience well. This animal, which is more than 3 feet long and a foot and a half high, coming towards me, those great rubbery lips. This is an animal called a Napoleon or a hump-headed wrasse, and they're perfectly harmless. They're curious, they're friendly. They inspect you with their swivel eyes on the edge of their head, and they have a propensity. They love hard-boiled eggs, and in some places where feeding fish is allowed, then the Napoleon wrasse gain a particular excitement about getting hard-boiled eggs from divers. They can get a little aggressive then, and that can lead to problems. So most resorts ban feeding fish like that. Sometimes you're lucky enough to come across these incredibly spectacular underwater sites, like this school of snappers, pictured again in the Red Sea off the southern tip of the Sinai Peninsula. This is a group of fish that have come together to reproduce, and they release their eggs into open water, underwater, and they drift away. They develop for a period of weeks to months, and then they settle back down onto a coral reef and start to grow. And it's absolutely amazing to be surrounded by a living wall of fish in this way. Another creature that is common on coral reefs is this hawksbill turtle, here chewing off a soft coral. Not many things like to eat soft corals because they're loaded with compounds that make them pretty distasteful, but these hawksbill turtles are perfectly happy to eat them. Hawksbills, if you're wondering, are the producers of tortoise shell, that beautiful kind of shell, which was used in the 19th century to turn into jewelry boxes and hair slides and combs and all sorts of things that people use. But of course, they've been protected for some time now because they became quite scarce. Also, you can't really go to a coral reef without wanting to see sharks. Sharks are absolutely incredible creatures, and they swim in and around coral reefs. And what we know now is that on really healthy, pristine coral reefs, there are lots and lots of sharks around. This one is actually a rare visitor. It comes in close to deep ocean reefs. This is the oceanic white-tipped shark, and is a particularly large and beautiful animal. And this is the largest of all the world's fish. This is the whale shark, and I've had the pleasure of diving with whale sharks on a number of occasions. They are huge, and they have this incredible pattern of spots all over them, which is like a constellation of stars. And indeed, scientists use a software program which was based on identifying which bit of the night sky that you're in from the pattern of stars. They use that program to identify which individual whale shark you're looking at from the pattern of spots. So you can identify animals as individuals, give them names, follow and understand their behavior by doing that. Now, one thing about a coral reef is that it looks like a relatively peaceful place, but it isn't. And a fish that lives on a coral reef is one moment's inattention away from death. If you're out there even for a moment, you lose your focus on staying alive, then something's going to snap you up. And here we can see big tarpon. These are about 4 or 5 feet long. This is photographed in the Caribbean around the Cayman Islands, and they are attacking these shoals of tiny little silvery fish. They also attack all sorts of other fish, but predation, the eating of other creatures, is something which happens on coral reefs a great deal, although it's so fast usually that you rarely are able to catch that moment. Here is a case in which some little fish, this long finger-like fish, those are being attacked from both sides. So you can see those bigger silvery fish in the yellow one. Those are predators. Those are trying to catch out the little fish. And below there's a grouper which is coming up, and that is going to try and attack them from below. So you really are constantly on the lookout if you're a coral reef fish. Not only fish, though, and I guess that quite a lot of people watching this will enjoy calamari, or otherwise known as squid or octopus. Now, I like calamari too, I have to confess, but you have to think twice about eating it when you see animals that are as smart as this octopus. This is the coconut octopus, and it lives in places where there isn't actually that much hiding places from predators. It lives associated with coral reefs, but on sandy areas like this. And a coconut octopus will literally carry around its own protection. And let me just show you what it looks like when it decides to take cover. So it can pull the coconut around itself and shut the lid like this. Absolutely remarkable behavior. These are extraordinarily intelligent animals. Now, octopuses end up battling over mates with each other, and you can see here a couple of common octopuses having a battle on a coral reef, again in the Red Sea, and they are incredible. These animals are probably 2 or 3 feet across from tentacle tip to tentacle tip, and what has only been observed a few times is this extraordinary behavior where a female octopus on the left, you can just see the eyes that are kind of up on stalks next to that coiling tentacle. That female octopus has long arms, and a male octopus has come up to her, and she's literally got to grab that male by the neck and strangle it, which is totally amazing behavior. Anyway, here's another animal which avoids the problem of getting eaten by mimicking something else, and it's a tiny little ghost pipefish, which looks like the blade of a seagrass, and it drifts around, and as it's drifting, it mimics the seagrass. So if the seagrass is just wafting backwards and forwards in a current, the fish will do exactly the same thing. It will just waft back and forwards in the current. Now, the interesting thing about this little fish, and you have to look really closely here, is that inside its stomach, you can see the outline of a fish that it's just eaten. Just have a really close look. There's a little eye in the middle of it, and that fish has just had a meal. Now, here's another solution to the problem of not getting eaten, but also to the problem of how do you get close enough to something for you to be able to eat it. This is a hairy frogfish, and you can see that a hairy frogfish really looks like a stone covered in seaweed. And if you look closely at this individual, so that hides it, it conceals it, it fools other fish into thinking that there's nothing here, certainly nothing to eat. But if you look on its forehead, just up here, there's a little kind of worm-like lure. And so what this frogfish does is to wave that, and that brings in other fish, so they're really close, and then it can snap open its mouth and take the prey there. Here's another few frogfish. So there's a sponge here in the middle of this image. You can see the sponge has this kind of trumpet shape. But there are 3 frogfish around it. One of them's yellow, so it's relatively easy to see, but the other 2 are exactly the same color and the same texture as a sponge. So they just look like sponges, and they know how to conceal themselves by being hidden in plain view. Another remarkable adaptation on the part of one of these fish. So here's another beautiful general scene of a coral reef. Now, coral reefs are the richest of shallow water marine habitats. So there's nowhere else, no other marine habitat in the world that has as many species living on it, many different kinds of animals and plants. And not all coral reefs are the same. Caribbean reefs are not as rich in terms of the number of species present as those in the Indian and Pacific Oceans. and those that lie right in the center between the Pacific Ocean on the one side and the Indian Ocean on the other, right in the middle in Southeast Asia, around Indonesia, the Philippines, Northern Australia, that is the center of the biological richness of coral reefs. And it's called the coral triangle quite often. And there's over 1,000 species of corals there, more than 3,000 different kinds of fish. And here you can see an image from the bullseye of that coral reef richness. This is from a place called Raja Ampat, which is right in the kind of center of biodiversity for coral reefs. And a wonderful array of fish and invertebrates there, giving you a sense of the place. But take a close look at these tiny little fish. There's kind of blizzard of tiny little fish in there. And I'll just zoom in a little bit closer on the image so you can see them better. And here, you know, they all look like these tiny little minnows underneath the golden yellow fish above them. And those are really interesting because they're things called convict blenny. Okay, I'm hoping you can see me all now. And we're all back in business, okay? And I'll move through to where I was. I was on slide 31, so let me just fast forward along to here and pick up from where we left off. Just bear with me a minute. Slide 31. This was the Nassau Grouper. So these are cleaning fish, and they have this relationship between predators and themselves. And actually, you can see a different kind of fish right inside the mouths of this animal here. The little stripy one, that's a cleaning goby as well. And so some fish are actually able to circumvent the problem of being eaten and get around predators. They're on the good side of predators. Here's another one which is actually clearly doesn't want to be hidden, and this is a fish which is itself very distasteful, and it's called a paddle flap scorpion fish, and you can see it's advertising the fact that this is an animal you don't want to mess with. It's not very big, it's about a foot long, but what you can see here is that this animal is striking. It wants to be seen, as does this. Now this is actually a really small creature. So each of these is minute, and they're little crustaceans that live on the surface of a sponge. The blue is the sponge, and they're maybe a millimeter or two long, maybe a tenth of an inch, something like that. And you can see that there are these bright yellow and orange colors. Now that tells you something special about this particular creature. And if you zoom in on some of these, what you can see now is that these are tiny little isopod crustaceans, so they're related to crabs and lobsters, but they're covered in these tiny little round globules. Some of them are orange, some of them are red, and some have only half of their body covered. And this is a really cool thing that these animals do. They grow their own food on their bodies. These are tiny little microbes. The orange and the yellow things are tiny little microbes, like the zooxanthellae that live in corals. They also photosynthesize and produce food like plants do. And when the isopod gets hungry, it'll just reach back and pluck an orange from its body and eat it. And you might think, well, how do they avoid being eaten? Well, the fact is that to anybody else, those little oranges are disgusting and they're horrible tasting, whereas to the isopod, it is the food of the gods. So here you have this tiny creature which can live in plain sight, which it has to because the plants need light, but because those are distasteful, it gets away with it. And finally, on my kind of bestiary of creatures from the coral reef, this is a facial mugshot of a stomatopod shrimp. And you can see those two eyes that are sitting on the top of its head. Well, those eyes are really special because this is one of the few creatures in the world which can see polarized light. So you know how you put on a pair of polarizing sunglasses and that takes away all the reflections and you can look underwater if you're on a boat? Well, polarizing sunglasses on a stomatopod shrimp enables it to see through all the kind of floating little particles of crud underwater, and it gets a more precise image of the world that it's living in. The other fun thing about stomatopods is you see these kind of big flaps down here. It's got these arms which are like boxers hand with boxing gloves on, and they can shoot those out so fast that they actually produce a spark of light underwater. Now, can you imagine the speed that you'd have to do that at? And this is one of the fastest animal movements on the planet, and they can hit things with incredible force, which is how they hunt their prey. So coral reefs are amazing places and quite remarkable environments, but they are under threat from people, and the biggest threats facing our planet really are just the sheer number of us and our demand for the world's resources and the pollution that we produce as we're using those resources. So the energy that we produces a lot of greenhouse gases, which is causing global warming to take place. And if you look at the big picture of how the world is changing, there's never been a period in which there have been more different ways in which the world is changing, nor such rapid change unfolding in human history. This is our generations are experiencing unprecedented change on planet Earth, and that's creating some problems. So this is the oceans. Here is a map of how the oceans are warming up. And you have to thank the oceans for warming up because they have absorbed more than 9/10 of the extra heat that greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide are trapping as a result of our fossil fuel burning. And if they hadn't done that, the temperature above water would have risen not just the present 1 degree centigrade, which is a couple of degrees Fahrenheit, but by 36 degrees centigrade. We'd all be experiencing kind of Death Valley temperatures if the oceans had not absorbed that heat. Now, the oceans have gone up a few degrees Fahrenheit, as you can see from this map. And that's not good for coral reefs because coral reefs are this incredible ecosystem, as I said. That's the Goldilocks ecosystem. It doesn't like it too hot. It doesn't like it too cold. And if it gets just a little too hot, the relationship between the alga that lives in the coral tissue and the coral animal breaks down, and they have to get rid of them because otherwise they'll die. But if they get rid of them for too long, if it's stressful for too long, the temperatures remain high for too long, then the coral dies. And so you end up with mass coral bleaching like this and coral death. So we've seen a big change in coral reefs over the last 30 years or so. They've gone from having lots and lots of coral, very healthy ecosystems, to having less coral, being more stressed, being often hit by these disasters where lots and lots of the coral dies. And the last time that happened was in 2015, 16, and into early 2017. And we've seen this event wrapping around the planet where coral reefs have been under very, very severe stress. One of the things that you might have noticed is that some people don't like talking about global climate change. And that reminds me of Voldemort in Harry Potter, he who must not be named. Now, Voldemort was this evil presence lurking in the background of every Harry Potter book, and people would say, he who must not be named. You've named you've named Voldemort. Global warming and climate change won't go away just by being ignored. We have to actually understand it. We have to do something about it because it won't go away. This is very well established in fact by science, and we know with great detail what has happened so far, we can predict into the future with less detail, but with enough concern that we know we have to do something about the problem that's unfolding. So one of the things that people are doing is to offer more protection to coral reefs. And this is a map of the Pacific Islands, which are owned by the United States. You can see Hawaii up in the top, and then there's a lot of really remote islands in there. And these have been established as large marine protected areas in an act of global responsible stewardship by a number of US presidents, including Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, and Barack Obama. And this really is something for your generation and for the futures to try and look after coral reefs much better, because they certainly absolutely need that. And this is what's at stake. This is a view of the Northwest Hawaiian Islands, one of the most dramatic and beautiful ecosystems on Earth, and we all hope that they stay that way. So I'm very happy to answer some questions. I see that there's a question over here at the moment, a connection between eutrophication and ocean acidification, right? Actually, the thing that there's a connection between is ocean acidification and greenhouse gas emissions. So what's going on is that we're releasing carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. That carbon dioxide then dissolves in the sea. And when you add carbon dioxide to a drink like Coca-Cola, then it becomes fizzy. The sea doesn't become fizzy because there's not enough of it, but it does become more acidic. And the acidity is what gives a Coca-Cola its tang. It's why it's very popular. So the oceans are becoming more acidic as a result of greenhouse gas emissions. And one of the things that more acidic oceans have less of is carbonate, and carbonate is necessary for corals to build their skeletons. So that is why this ocean acidification is not at all good for coral reefs. In terms of the kind of ranking of problems that coral reefs face, it's low on the list right now. Warming is a much more serious problem, as well as all sorts of stresses that affect coral reefs right now. So things like overfishing is bad for a coral reef. Eutrophication, so when we add nutrients to a system, then so extra nitrogen, extra phosphorus, and that happens when rain washes agricultural fertilizers off the land and into the sea. What that does is it gives a boost to the seaweeds that live on coral reefs at the expense of the coral. So seaweeds grow really fast when they have lots of nutrients, and they can overgrow the coral, and that causes problems. So that's a big issue in some places. Not in the middle of the ocean, in an uninhabited island, it isn't. But really warming, overfishing, pollution from nutrients. Another thing which people talk about a lot in regard to the oceans these days is plastic pollution. And I'm sure many of you have seen just how much plastic is ending up in the sea, just huge quantities. An estimated 8 million tons of plastic end up in the oceans every year, either deliberately dumped or washed into the sea from rivers, and they have been accumulating. Plastic doesn't go away. It just breaks down into smaller and smaller pieces, and when plastic garbage gets wrapped around coral heads, then it can cause them a lot of harm, and they become more susceptible to disease. So that's one thing that we really want to try and cut back on in the future. And you have to ask yourself, what is the point of all these plastic straws that people keep using? And we've got these perfectly good things called lips, which enable us to drink from cups. We don't need a plastic straw that lasts hundreds of years after it's been chucked away to do that. And to interact for a few minutes with something that lasts hundreds of years seems crazy. And luckily, I think we're beginning to see a backlash against the tide of plastic that we are we are releasing into our oceans today. So think about that next time you are offered something that is disposable and used within a few moments, and also make sure that stuff doesn't get into the ocean. So I'm happy to answer any other questions that you might have. Just finished writing a book on coral reefs, actually, which describes how they've changed in the last 30 years and how they might change in the next 30 years or so under various sorts of scenarios. So I have a question here. Can coral reefs expand into other areas the oceans get warmer? They already are. Not as reefs, but as corals. So if you think about it, the first wave of these corals, the corals are finding areas which are becoming habitable at the edges of their ranges. So they start out just a few corals which stick to the rocks and start growing. And then gradually, over a period of hundreds and thousands of years, those would establish themselves into reefs. So the reefs that we have around today are thousands and thousands of years old. Sometimes, I mean, all of them have been really growing since the end of the last ice age, 10,000 years ago or so. But those new reefs growing on top of, they're growing on top of old reefs that grew before. So, there are some areas where the reefs underlying the modern bit of the reef are billions of years old. So, what was my book called again? Well, it hasn't been published yet, and the title will no doubt change. The answer is, the working title is Coral Reef Odyssey, and it's my journey around coral reefs and how coral reefs are changing. So it's a bit of an odyssey for both of us. Do I think the Great Barrier Reef has a chance of surviving the warmer temperatures? Well, that's the great question that we face at the moment, is can any coral reef survive these warmer temperatures? What happened, for those who are unfamiliar, I mentioned the 2015-16 warming event. That was linked to a global climatic phenomenon called El Nino, which starts in the Eastern Pacific and then really big ones propagate around the world. They cause all sorts of climate disruptions, so wildfires in California, flooding as well, wildfires in Australia, flooding in Australia. So it's kind of a, between the devil and the deep blue sea with an El Nino. And what that does is it heats up the ocean. And that ocean heating caused all these coral reefs to be affected, and much of them died. I work in the Maldives in the Indian Ocean quite a lot. And in some places, 99% of all the coral died in 2016. In other places, it wasn't quite as severe, but still half of the coral died. So it was a really savage episode of warming. And in the northern Great Barrier Reef, this is an area which suffered the worst coral bleaching that it's ever experienced, so far as we know. And the question is, can it survive? Well, we're doing our very best to give it the best chance to survive by protecting it well. It's protected from fishing. It's got intact forested landscape next to it, so there's no agricultural runoff. So we're looking after it as best we can, but the only thing that's really going to save coral reefs is bringing down greenhouse gas emissions. And we've got to shift to renewable source of energy. We've got to become carbon neutral in order to do that. It really is that simple. So I'm happy to answer any more questions if you've got any. Since there are so many different species of coral, are we going to have reefs that just lack diversity, or do we entirely lose the reef? That's a really good question. I think we're already seeing that the changes underway are making reefs simpler. After previous episodes where corals have died off, what's come back is a little bit less rich. There aren't so many of the rare species around. Some of the common species disappear as well because they're not able to cope with that extra warming. And so, each time you knock something back, what comes back is going to be a little bit less diverse. But that's not a good reason to abandon coral reefs to their fate. Exactly the opposite. I think what we need to do is to redouble our efforts to protect them and to keep them in a good state. So one thing that we can do is to alleviate all of these other stresses. So although the Great Barrier Reef in the northern section has lost a lot of coral, by protecting it from fishing, it can still be full of fish. It can still be an amazing place to visit. It will still be able to sustain lots of tourists. It'll be valuable. And for people in developing countries where they rely on fish for food, then what you can see there is that protecting them, keeping the fish healthy and abundant is going to be really important to their long-term livelihoods. So what happens to the fish that live on the reef? Can they go to a new habitat? Well, yes and no. So in the Maldives where I work, during this period when the corals were dying, there are certain kinds of fish which really need certain kinds of coral. So there's a little bright green one, which is called the emerald chromis. And they live among the branches of living corals, and they're incredibly abundant when that coral is abundant. When the coral died, they died too. And unfortunately, they didn't really have anywhere close enough to go. And if you move away from the shelter of the coral, then you become very exposed to predators, as I was talking about. So you get snapped up. And there are also little filefish, one of the most beautiful filefish I know. I can't remember what its common name is. It's called Oxymonicanthus hallei. It's an absolutely exquisite filefish. Beautiful orange spots, each one circled in green on a bright blue body. The eyes are like little Venetian glass beads. They're exquisite. They all disappeared as a result of the coral dying because they were completely dependent on that coral. So, maintaining a healthy reef is going to be important to sustaining species like that, making sure that they don't disappear altogether. But it's going to be an uphill struggle to do that. So what's my favorite type of coral? That is, that's a difficult one. I love the brain corals. I think they're incredible, and you can get brain corals which got very narrow, meandering valleys. They come up to sharp ridges. You can get them with great big fleshy lobes, which look more like our brains. And so, they're also wonderful colors. Some of them are green, some of them yellow, some of them are kind of dark mottled brown. Little fish sit on top of them. So that's certainly, I think, among my favorite corals. But the branching corals too, what give a reef some of its spectacular structure. A little coral like this is one of the commonest corals on a coral reef. This is something called Poecilopora in its scientific name, and it can be pink or purple. It's a little bit like a head of broccoli. Just a wonderful animal, I think. They have so much beauty, both from the huge scale, if you're looking at a coral reef, from a distance, but also from the tiny looking at a coral reef, from a distance, but also from the tiny scale. And one of the things you really have to do with corals is to get close up and look at the microstructure of the polyps, and there are little stars in there. There are valleys. There are also animals that live in among the coral. So on this branch, you won't be able to see it with this computer camera, but there's a little barnacle which lives in there. There are sponges. There are also little crabs that can make the corals grow around them, so that they literally have their own tiny protected fortress within the coral. But some of us might think of it as being a jail cell. There's this coral and they're stuck. They can never get out. But they can get their food. It passes through. They filter little particles from the water which they pump through this cell that they've made themselves. So quite an extraordinary sort of wildlife there. So what about people with saltwater aquariums? Are they problems, or do they act as an arc for future establishment? Well, that's a good question. One of the funny things is that after the film Finding Nemo was released, and the whole movie is about poor little Nemo, this anemone fish, which has been caught and put in somebody's aquarium. The whole movie is about helping to free Nemo back into the ocean. And yet after Finding Nemo was released, lots of people started buying little anemone fish and putting them in their aquarium. So what does that tell you about us? I don't know. It tells us that we love these animals more than we're willing perhaps to leave them in the open ocean. So I think aquariums are a way that you can really connect with the marine environment. I have my own freshwater aquarium. I'm not a good enough aquarist to keep saltwater fish, but there is a possibility that you can look after certain species in aquaria. There's something called the Banggai cardinal fish, which is a very rare animal in the wild. It only lives in a very small part of Indonesia, and yet there are a zillion of them around the world in aquaria. So it's not at all uncommon. It's just that it's not living on coral reefs in most places. So in a way, that's doing some good. In another way, though, aquarists sometimes do misguided things, and one of them was to release lionfish into the Caribbean. And so these lionfish, which are ferocious predators on the coral reef, they live in the Pacific Ocean and the Indian Ocean, where they do, they live untroubled lives, but they were released into the Caribbean in the 1990s and have exploded across the entire Caribbean, changing it forever. So that's something which we want to try and avoid. So how did I get into this career? Well, I got lucky. I was always interested in the sea, and I lived by the sea in Scotland as a kid. I never went abroad before I went to university. And my first trip abroad was when I was 20 years old, and I went to Saudi Arabia to study coral reefs with one of my professors at university. And he knew I would be completely bowled over by the experience, and sure enough, I was. I absolutely loved it. And it was a moment. Sometimes in life you have a moment where you know that everything's changed, and that the past is done with. There is a different kind of future ahead of you. And I knew that the moment that I swam across my first coral reef in the Red Sea, I knew this was going to be my life from then on. And I did everything that I could to make sure it was. I studied hard. I was the most diligent student, which I hadn't really been up to that point. And, suddenly I really understood what it was that I wanted from life. So I've been very lucky. And could you get more involved if you live in the Midwest? Well, the Midwest is not easy to get to the ocean, but no harder in a way to think about coral reefs than it was in the north of Scotland. I think there are many ways you can access coral reefs, kind of remotely, using video links. You can contribute to citizen science projects that scientists are doing in places with coral reefs. There are all sorts of opportunities online to do that. But above all, try and persuade your folks to take you on a vacation somewhere warm, where you might be able to get in the sea and start looking at things firsthand. And as time goes on, you'll find more opportunities, I think, to see coral reefs. So I hope you've enjoyed this little presentation, and it's given you a taste of what coral reefs are like. I love them. They are among the most remarkable places on planet Earth, and may they exist forevermore. Thank you very much.